The fairies' jewelry box. The moment Lucinda set foot in the glass greenhouse, she found herself surrounded by deeply vibrant verdure everywhere she looked. Though she found the strong, humid scent of unfamiliar flowers quite unpleasant, she continued on. As she recalled, it should be hidden among the roots of a large fern. She approached the tall, eye-catching plant, crouched down, and started to rummage around its leafy base. Lucinda lifted the jewelry box with both hands. Decorated with ivory fretwork, it was gorgeous enough to be admired as a work of art independent of its contents. No wonder it had been chosen as the hiding place for Lady Orchard's splendid regard necklace. Lucinda was almost certain it had to have a fake base. That, or there was another sort of trick to it that opened up a hidden compartment. She tried shaking it and turning it upside down among other things, but she was unable to find the necklace. Perhaps I shall need to break it. It was highly ornamental. But while the box itself was very expensive, the necklace should be even more valuable. Besides, Lucinda was desperate to try it on for herself. Surely her aunt wouldn't mind her borrowing it, since she wasn't in a position to ask permission anyway. And while the jewelry box belonged to Lady Orchard too, Lucinda would simply blame Annie for any damage she did to it. The maid was to be dismissed in any case, leaving her with no opportunity to defend herself. Lucinda surveyed her surroundings for a means by which she might break the box. Her eyes fell upon the stone wall that surrounded a nearby flower bed. A knock against that might well suffice. She stood up and made to raise the box above her head. That was when she heard footsteps approaching from behind her. Startled, she tried to turn around, only for her arms to be taken into a tight hold. The box fell from her grip and its lid fell loose, but it remained intact. A man picked it up and sneered at her. "This is the box with the regard necklace, right?" She now realized she was presently surrounded by a number of unfamiliar men. "Who are you people? Oi, hurry up and break it open so we can see what's inside." A hand was clasped over Lucinda's mouth, and now she could only watch as the man struck the box against the stone wall. Its shards flew every which way. The men gathered around it to check under its base, behind its lid, and anywhere there might be a hidden seam. "It's not air," one eventually muttered. "I don't see no necklace," another agreed. "That can't be right," thought Lucinda. "Where'd you hide it?" She trembled as a knife was pulled on her. "Nowhere. I don't know. Help. What's this all about, Annie? You said this wench hid the necklace." Annie. Lucinda dared a glance. The girl with them was dark-haired, but the face was undeniably her maid's. "That's what I want to know," Annie said. "Come on, Lady Lucinda. If you don't want to get hurt, you'll tell us where the necklace is." "What are you doing, Annie?" "What, you don't understand why you're former maids in the company of ruffians? I'm one of them, that's why. We drew up a plan to burgle this estate together." You're a thief." "I suppose that's what you'd call me. The reason I approached you in the first place was so I could get here without drawing suspicion. I was once hired here temporarily, but I got driven out right away for stealing some pocket money. That was about the time I heard there were lots of valuable jewels here, though. It was then that she decided to disguise her hair color, pretend to be mute, and become Lucinda's handmaid. As a guest servant, neither Lady Orchard's butler nor housekeeper would have any reason to look into her background or keep a close eye on her. Annie always kept her head down, so there was no chance of anyone here recognizing her as a former employee. "I knew you were looking for a maid who couldn't speak, so that's why I put on the act. I pulled it off well, don't you think?" Annie looked down her nose at her former mistress. She was a far cry from the girl who trembled at every little scolding. She was even smiling scornfully. To think she was one of these jewel thieves. Lucinda was too shocked to know what to say, which was when one of the men struck her impatiently. "Where's the regard necklace? You can say you dunno, but then we won't have a reason to keep you alive no more." Having fallen to the ground, Lucinda tried to pull away, only for the men to surround her. "Please, Annie, let me go. Remember all the treats I shared with you?" Annie laughed and trod on Lucinda's skirts. You tossed your leftovers on the floor and told me to pick them up. I don't call that sharing. What a stupid thing to say. Now you've reminded me, I just want to teach you an even harsher lesson. You would kill me simply because I am a nuisance. Lucinda's only recourse now was to sob. That's enough, you scoundrels, came a sudden cry. There were some familiar faces at the greenhouse entrance, a group of the estate's servants, inexplicably armed with pistols. Among them was a tall, slender figure with golden hair. There is no escape for you now, and there's no point resisting either. Drop your weapons. It was the short-haired servant who spoke, but Lucinda only had eyes for one of the men. Lord Ashenbert. When she tried to stand, Annie pushed her down by the shoulders. The former maid pressed the knife against Lucinda's cheek and raised her voice. Damn it all. That was your game, was it? That Earl tricked us. What is she talking about? This was a trap. There is no regard necklace in that box. You certainly took your time coming to that conclusion. Lucinda gazed at the handsome Earl's faint smile, her mind in disarray. He'd lied about the regard necklace being in the ivory box. Had Lord Ashenbert been dishonest? He knew that she had hidden it. He knew that if she heard the necklace was within it, she would retrieve it, and that Annie and the thieves would follow. He had revealed that Annie could speak because he knew she was part of the gang. The former maid backed away, still using the stunned Lucinda as a shield. God's sake. You don't care what happens to the girl. Why don't you lot drop your weapons? One of the men shouted, rousing his companions to fight. The servants continued to inch forward regardless, pistols at the ready. Lucinda felt Annie's grip tighten on the knife, and she panicked. Stay back. She's going to kill me. Oh, Lord Ashenbert, save me. The Earl, a man who by all rights should want to be her fiancé, merely smiled when she cried out in terror. Not only that, but he was smiling at Annie, not her. You must be aware that you are acting in vain, Annie. The former maid jumped as he named her specifically, no doubt due to her memories of the burning poker. Lucinda grew frightened as well. Lord Ashenbert had not shied away from cruelty. He was telling Annie that there was no point in using a hostage as a shield. In other words, it didn't matter what might befall Lucinda, he was interested only in apprehending the thieves. The noble girl understood Annie's fear so completely that she herself was struck silent. If you would, Lieutenant, the Earl said calmly. My lord, the hostage. Your mistress's safety weighed against the life of that hostage. I dare say you are in no position to hesitate. Fine. The servant stepped forward just as a shattering of glass sounded from behind Lucinda. A shadowy figure came flying in, kicked down one of the men before her, and used that momentum to tear her away from Annie. That was when the brawl began. Lucinda cowered at the crack of a gunshot but was immediately pulled up again by the dark-skinned boy who'd saved her. She recognized him as Lord Ashenbert's servant. Out. He all but pushed her through the hole in the glass and out of the greenhouse. She ran without looking back. Although the Earl hadn't technically left her to die, she struggled to recognize it. When she brought her hand up to her painful neck, she realized she was bleeding. The servant's rough handling had led Annie's knife to skim her. One misstep and she would have been dead. She suspected that Lord Ashenbert wouldn't have shed a single tear for her, even though he had once defended her mother from criticism. She now realized that it had only been because he was reminded of his own fiancée, a woman below his station. Still, she had thought herself more worthy of him than a commoner. Lucinda continued to run until she was out of breath and her steps were sluggish. Judging that she had come far enough, she stopped. As she caught her breath, she looked around and tried to identify where she was. She couldn't initially, because she had run thoughtlessly at full pelt through the vast gardens. They were growing gloomy, with the moon as their sole light. Lucinda touched a nearby hedge, only to withdraw her hand in pain. It was a rose bush. In fact, this was a rose garden. The thorny flowers sat in every direction. Now she thought of it, she had heard that her aunt was fond of cultivating roses. It shouldn't be a curious thing for a rose garden to occupy these spacious grounds, and yet the ghostly stone pillars and the flowers curling around them unsettled her. The wind blew, and the thorned foliage shook as if laughing at her. The rose, the queen of flowers, was so beautiful as to draw every eye toward it, much like Lucinda herself. She wanted to obtain a husband of whom everyone would be envious and get back at the girls who spoke ill of her. She had thought it would be a most simple matter. And yet, Lord Ashenbert was attracted to that common girl who was ordinary in every way. Lucinda couldn't understand how she had lost out. And now the foliage, free of flowers but with plenty of thorns, was mocking her. It threatened her with its spikes, telling her she was no flower, no exalted rose, and that she would leave if she knew what was good for her. Unable to bear it any longer, she tried to run, only for a figure to emerge between the hedges and block her path. "Annie. You're not going anywhere. I've still got a lesson to teach you." Lucinda broke into a run. Annie pursued. When the former tried to dive into the garden's thicker shrubbery, the latter grabbed her by the hair. Lucinda was frantic as the pair grappled. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet vanished. Losing her balance, she tumbled into the apparent pitfall, still gripping Annie. She slammed onto the ground, the former maid's weight trapping her, having no energy to brace herself against the pain that rippled through her entire body. What is this place? It was no wonder that Annie marveled. The meandering, gutter-like tunnel looked like it continued on and on forever. The dirt walls on either side were covered with grass, the ceiling a woven patchwork of thick growth, like a cavern made of plant life instead of rock. Annie stood up, keeping a firm grip on Lucinda's arm to prevent her from running. "This might make a good spot to hide out. Just remember that you're dead if they find us, yeah? If they're going to kill me, I'm taking you down with me." Lucinda had hurt her leg and was forced to limp as Annie dragged her deeper into the tunnel's depths. It didn't take very long to capture the gang of thieves. Billy's men and Raven beat them until they couldn't stand before tying them up. It was only then that Edgar noticed Annie's absence. "It seems we are down one woman, Lieutenant," he said. "Annie, what's a girl going to be able to do by herself?" "She is a capable girl. She was fully prepared to assault Lady Ortred by herself. It would be prudent to locate her as soon as possible." "Oi, Earl," Nico called. He was peering into the greenhouse through the smashed glass. "The girl you're looking for went running in Lydia's direction. She's wandered into a fairy passage with Lucinda in tow." "What? Where is this passage, Nico?" "At the end of the rose garden. It leads to the Dane's garden. I was following it to get to Lydia, only for those two to fall from above. I hid myself post-haste, but that maid had hurt the girl and was saying something about dying together. That's strange, I thought to myself." "You can talk to cats, my lord," Billy interjected. To his eyes, Edgar was communicating with a grey mewling feline. The Earl turned around. "Her Majesty and her Ladyship are in danger. Annie is moving toward them." He then peered at the lieutenant, who looked suitably dubious. "Are you aware of my official title?" "The Earl of Ibrazel." "Precisely. And you will know that this is no cat, but a fairy gentleman." Billy still looked somewhat unconvinced. "Come, Raven," Edgar said. He turned on his heel, and Nico ran forth on his hind legs to lead the way. As their surroundings grew darker, the moonlight grew brighter. Lydia and the two noble women stared transfixed at the rose bush before them. The moonlight hit, and the blue bulbs raised their heads like they were awakening. Then they shuddered as if overcome with joy. They swelled up before the women's very eyes, and their petals pushed outward so far they seemed to be at risk of falling loose and scattering. The flowers bloomed one after another, their blue spreading out from within and curling subtly into their full elegant form. Such was the speed at which the fairy roses opened, and presently they peered up at their observers with pride. Lady Ortred broke off one of the branches and passed a large flower to Brightberry. "Thank you, Virginia. As lamentable as it is, these roses cannot be removed from the garden. Regardless, this rose is for you." The Countess had explained before that the flowers wilted when taken to the outside world. It was likely because the fairies wanted to keep them here. If only there were a way to take them back. Lydia had been considering the matter for some time. Was the flower wreath made from gems after all? At this moment in time, they looked like natural rippling flowers. Perhaps it was a consequence of being in the fairy world. What a curious color, Brightberry said. Like the vivid blue of turquoise. All the roses here were similar. The white of pearl, the pink of coral, the yellow of tortoiseshell. Where could the Danes be hiding their treasure? Somewhere within this magical rose garden? Or perhaps... A sudden rumbling interrupted Lydia's train of thought. What was that? The Duchess asked. I'm not certain. It sounded like something breaking, Lydia said, though she felt a keen sense of foreboding. Look. Lady Ortred pointed at a section of the garden that could be seen from upon the hill where they stood. The rosebed that should have been there was now enveloped in darkness. What is that, Lydia? It can't be. I think the rose garden might be crumbling. The fairies had threatened to bury this place. Had they grown impatient and decided not to wait until dawn after all? Explain yourselves, Danes. It is too early for you to close the garden. After a short pause, a disembodied voice replied, We have to start now to have the garden buried by dawn, Fairy Doctor. I thought they would be starting at dawn. That was why it was so important to be cautious when making promises with fairies. Still, lamenting would do nothing to solve the situation. In that case, I ask that you go about your work as slowly as you can, she said. We can't do that. There is a thief trying to enter the garden. The girl who tried to stab the companion who took Virginia's place, another fairy elaborated. What? That cannot be, Lydia protested. A thief should not be able to find the entrance. She is with Virginia's blood relative. The path is open to the humans from the house, but we accidentally let in the blood relative. The thief is holding her hostage. Taken aback, Lydia turned to the Countess. Did you hear that, Lady Ortred? Lady Lucinda is in danger. Her face ran pale. Goodness me, I hadn't even realized she had come yet. We will stop the intruders, Fairy Doctor, a Dane said. In other words, they would offer to grant the girl's wishes in exchange for them turning back. However, regardless of what the thief did, there was a risk that Lucinda would answer the voice at the garden's entrance. That would put her at the mercy of terrible fairy magic. No, Danes, I shall drive the intruders out. Do not ask for their wishes just yet. There was no response. The fairies must have already been on their way to the entrance. Lydia turned to the noble women and spoke rapidly. Please stay where you are. The thief in question could be armed. We cannot let a young lady such as yourself brave such danger either. In what was a surprisingly valiant action, Lady Ortred lifted a large shovel over her shoulder. But this is the Danes' territory. It is very different to the human world. I shall rescue Lady Lucinda one way or another. Lydia turned on her heel, raced down the hill with the blue roses, and made for the garden's entrance. As she followed the rose hedges across the grass, the earth trembled again. Another section of the garden must have crumbled. If she didn't act quickly, there would be no time left to escort Brightberry out. The green tunnel came into view when she at last reached the flagstone path. There were two figures standing just in front of it. One was Lucinda, and the other must have been the thief who tried to attack Lady Ortred. Annie. The maid was holding Lucinda at knife point, a realization that made Lydia stop in her tracks. When Annie saw the fairy doctor approach from the other side of the shrubbery, she visibly braced herself and pulled her mistress in closer. You, Lydia. What are you doing here? As surprised as Lydia was to hear the supposedly mute maid speak, she was also being presented with a much more shocking truth. Annie, are you truly the thief who assaulted Lady Ortred? The girl merely clicked her tongue. Help me, Lydia, Lucinda called out feebly. Annie gave an exaggerated scoff. You really think she'll help you after you tried to make it look like she stole your brooch? As I suspected. Despite the realization, Lydia couldn't bring herself to lose her temper with Lucinda at present. I ask that you unhand her, Annie. No. I'm being pursued. I promise to let you go if you unhand her. Just please refrain from hurting anyone else. Annie glared at her in disbelief. Then, her lip curled. Oh, I remember now. You and that Earl were very familiar with each other. This is perfect. You take this wench's place, she's a rubbish hostage. The Earl doesn't seem to care if she dies. Exactly, Lydia, Lucinda stammered. His lordship wouldn't allow you to die. It sounded as though Edgar was Annie's pursuer. That would explain why Lucinda's life was at risk. This new information made Lydia hesitate. But there was no time to lose in any case. She needed to get Annie out and stop the fairies from destroying the garden. Very well. I shall take Lady Lucinda's. The ground rumbled again before she could finish her sentence, and she drew back in panic. A deep crevice had opened up between her and the other girls. The Danes must have been trying to prevent Annie from taking a single step into the garden. The next thing Lydia knew, a great number of the fairies were surrounding them. They were all looking their way, some from the gaps in the leaves, others from the branches of trees, and yet more from the roots of the rose bushes. They wore the pelts and feathers of small animals and birds. Since they were in the fairy world, Lucinda and Annie should have been able to see them too. They both seemed stunned into silence. What are those? Annie managed. Listen well, humans. We'll grant you one wish, but in return, you must leave here immediately. The Dane's voice resounded clearly through the moonlit night. They were only capable of casting their magic on someone who made a deal with them. That was why they were the first to offer. A wish? Lucinda murmured, raising her head. She seemed to be on the verge of wishing for help. Lydia began to panic. No. You mustn't respond. Precisely. You have just one wish. You ought to put due consideration into it, came Edgar's voice. He appeared with Raven and Nico from the gutter-like tunnel. Annie turned, her expression freezing, then pulled Lucinda in to shield herself before covering the girl's mouth. What will you do, Annie? Or shall I speak first and wrest the wish from you? Edgar. Lydia made to speak up, but stopped short when she felt a cautioning hand on her shoulder. Brightberry was standing behind her. She and Lady Ortred had come down from the hill, both of them watching the scene before them with bated breath. I am permitted to state a wish too, am I not, fairies? Edgar went on. The right is granted to anyone who sets foot here. Lucinda was moaning incomprehensibly behind Annie's hand, apparently trying to voice a wish. Allow me to think for a moment. As I recall, there is a legend that states you fairies have hidden vast quantities of gemstones on this land for generations now, Edgar began. Those gems are ours, Annie shouted suddenly. They belong to us. Fairies, are you? You say you can grant any wish, so give me every last jewel, embellish my entire body with them. A pillar of light enveloped her then. It was so bright that it forced everyone to avert their gaze. When it died down and Lydia was able to look again, the great light pillar had become one of crystal. Annie, Lucinda murmured, and only then did Lydia realize that the structure was shaped like the former maid. We embellished you as you asked. You're satisfied, yes, one of the fairies said before they all burst into laughter. Humans are nothing but masses of greed. They can't hold their tongues once they think their wish'll be granted. They can't ever hold their tongues. They'd be much happier without them. Lydia couldn't help but see the irony in the Danes, of all fairies, accusing others of being loose-lipped. Then there was Annie, who had pretended to be mute all this time, only for such a fate to befall her when she finally opened her mouth. Nevertheless, Lucinda was now safe. Released from her captor's grip, she cowered on the ground. Lydia let out a sigh of relief that they had avoided the worst-case scenario as she watched Lady Ortred leap boldly over the deep crevice and run to Lucinda's side. The strength left Lydia, and she was on her way to collapsing when someone caught her arm, and she looked up hastily. Edgar's face was positioned close to hers, looking a touch angry. You failed to spare a single thought for me, Lydia. She could only falter in return. You may be soft-hearted, But that doesn't excuse your eagerness to take Lady Lucinda's place. Should anything ever happen to you, I would be unable to carry out the rest of my life alone. He must have heard me, she lamented. Brightberry let out a chuckle. Embarrassed by Edgar's open display of affection, Lydia flushed. But then, the ground shook again. Panicking, she clung to her fiancé. The shaking continued violently, widening the crevice before them. "The thief is gone, Danes. Do not destroy the rose garden," she called. "We are going to leave at dawn in any case," came the response. "If you really know our secret, fairy doctor, then hurry up and state your wish." The pressure was so great that she struggled to reply. "Forgive me, Duchess, but might I ask you to jump to the other side at once, lest you are unable to return to the real world?" Edgar urged in a display of quick thinking. "My servant will assist you." After exchanging a glance with Raven, who stood on the other side of the crevice, Edgar pushed the Duchess forth. The boy caught and steadied her before leading her to safer ground. Edgar took hold of Lydia's arm. "Come." However, the ground would not stop rocking, and when they made to step forward, it crumbled beneath them. They drew back, only for the crevice to open up further and make leaping across difficult. "You can still make it, Lydia," Edgar urged. "It is too late, the rose garden will continue to collapse. I must bargain with the Danes. It was the only way to save Lady Ortred." "Can you do it?" he asked. "If I cannot, you will meet your end here with us," she replied. "There is nothing I desire more than to share my fate with you." Edgar squeezed her hand and smiled, his presence calming her. Lydia was filled with the belief that what she could not achieve alone, she could achieve with him. "Hear my words, Danes," she called out to their surroundings. "You will return everyone here to the human world unharmed. That is the wish I shall exchange for your secret." "Do you really know our secret?" "I do." "Then we will accept your terms. You will forget our secret, fairy doctor, and we will release everyone here." Lydia nodded and closed her eyes. She focused on the thoughts that had been so close to coming together moments earlier. Where was the Danes' treasure hidden? The fairies had kept close ties with the masters of this estate for several generations. They opened the path to the rose garden to anyone wearing Lady Ortred's regard necklace, the very same necklace that opened the door to the magnificent jewelry the Countess once wore when socializing. Where did that bronze door lead to anyway? If the regard necklace was the key to both that door and to this garden, then perhaps going through it would allow one to reach this place. And suppose that here, the Countess's necklace transformed from an intricate item of jewelry to a ring of living flowers? You do not keep your treasure hidden, Danes. You cultivate your jewels and watch them bloom. Is that not what these roses are? Though each flower that blooms in this land eventually withers, each one of them is formed by genuine jewels. The fairies fell silent, and Lydia feared she might have been mistaken. Edgar took her into a protective embrace. But then, the Danes started to panic. "What? She knows our secret. Who told her? How many times have we said to keep your mouth shut when in the human world? We have to run. Quickly. We'll have no more business with you, fairy doctor." There came a gust of wind that swept the Danes chattering away into the rustling of the nearby foliage. It whipped leaves into the sky that blocked out the moonlight and plunged the area into a split-second darkness. The wind and the noise calmed, the quiet moonlight returned, and everyone who had stood in that mysterious space was now in the estate's ordinary rose garden, joined by the statue of Mary. Brightberry stared curiously at the object in her open palm. It was the blue rose. But rather than the flower Lady Ortred had cultivated, as it appeared in the fairy world, here it took the form of an intricate turquoise piece. "It is precisely the same color as your roses, Virginia," the Duchess said. "Goodness!" Lady Ortred exclaimed. "It must be a gift from the fairies," Lydia said, and Brightberry nodded in agreement. Surely, the Countess had grown so many flowers for their pleasure that to show their appreciation, they had allowed her to take just one of the blue roses from the garden, the variety she had put more effort into than any other. Lydia dreamed that night. She was attending a ball in a large hall that she didn't recognize. The room was so vast that she could not see any one of its corners, and men and women in extravagant attire passed back and forth before her. The gold and silver ornaments on the impossibly high ceiling reflected the light of the chandelier. She stared up at it, entranced, as a noble woman came to stand beside her. She felt she ought to recognize the woman, but no name came to her. Regardless, she could not take her eyes from the turquoise rose that adorned the woman's breast. The craftsmanship was so exquisite that it could easily be mistaken for a real flower. It was then that Lydia realized she was getting several looks. Either it was because of the noblewoman speaking to her, or it was because I'm wearing an ordinary dress rather than a gown. It was no wonder she was being laughed at by these guests in their splendid evening wear. Her hair wasn't even done up. The thought made her feel awkward, and she turned her gaze to the floor. The woman with the blue rose said something to her. Lydia looked up in the direction she was gesturing and saw Edgar there. He approached them, then surprised her by getting down on one knee. He then kissed the back of her ungloved hand as though she were a princess. "Might I request this dance, Miss Carlton? As your fiancée?" Her hand in his and the way he looked so intently at her was enough to make Lydia dismiss all embarrassment regarding her inappropriate attire, for Edgar would make her shine brighter than even the most splendorous jewel. As long as he treasured her so, the spell that transformed her from an ordinary girl into a princess would never break, even if the clock struck midnight. "Lydia," came Edgar's whisper into her ear, "you may leave to me the things with which you have trouble. You are perfect the way you are. My task is to create the magic that will make you appear more suited to these lavish surroundings than anybody else." She felt his hand on her cheek. His kiss on her forehead. Edgar's ash-mauve eyes softened as he smiled at her. When he pulled away, there was a quiet clinking sound. The sound came from the waking world, and it broke through Lydia's doze. She cracked her eyes open to see the bedroom door closing quietly. "Edgar." She no longer became indignant when he entered her chamber without asking. She supposed he had come to check on her out of concern since she had collapsed yesterday. The sun was already high in the sky. The light glowing through the curtain told Lydia that she had been asleep for quite some time. When she moved her head, she heard another clink. She brought her hand to her chest, where her fingers came into contact with a necklace. Fully conscious at last, she sat up and picked up the hand glass from her bedside table. The necklace was set with a row of 6 types of stone. Each of them was suitably sizable and none outshone the others. Diamond, emerald, amethyst, ruby, sapphire, and topaz. Taking the first letter of each stone in the order they were placed spelled out dearest. It was a regard necklace. Never had Lydia expected to receive one. She smiled as she ran her fingertips over the chain. "I must get up at once and go to thank him. I pray that I shall be able to convey my delight without embarrassment." By the time dawn broke, Lydia and everyone who had been in the rose garden had entirely forgotten about the Dane's secret. Any memories they did have were hazy and could easily be mistaken for a dream. Nevertheless, Lydia did remember speaking to the fairies and striking a deal with them. Lady Ortred, too, did not doubt that she had spent time among the fae. Here in the human world, her regard necklace had returned to an intricate arrangement of gemstones. Each of its flowers was substantial, their petals embedded with countless tiny jewels. But for all that, the door that it should have been able to open remained tightly closed. A closer inspection of the door in question revealed that there was no gap between it and the wall. Rather, it was a decorative piece embedded into the wall itself. The Countess expressed that she couldn't be certain whether it had opened before, or whether she had simply been dreaming. Apparently, it had led to the gutter-like path that took one to the rose garden. Wearing the regard necklace opened the door, allowing access to the fairy world. The diverse jewelry the Countess was famed for wearing had always come from her late husband, who fetched the pieces from beyond the door. Similarly, he would return them there when she was finished with them. Perhaps he had simply borrowed them from the Danes. But now the door wouldn't open. It was possible that the fairy rose garden beyond it no longer existed. Although Lady Ortred seemed to lament the loss of flowers, There was a briskness to the smile she showed Lydia, as if she was ready to put it all behind her. She had succeeded in cultivating a blue rose, fulfilling her promise to her closest friend. Though Lydia sensed that part of her wanted to return to the garden if she could, the Countess admitted that she doubted she would ever have cultivated a finer rose, even if she'd had all the time in the world there. "I'm very sorry, Lydia. You've been through an awful lot on my account." Lady Ortred had invited Lydia and Edgar to the parlor that afternoon. "Not to mention my dear niece." The Countess had heard Lucinda insist that the fairy doctor take her place as Annie's hostage. She had also questioned her niece about the various schemes she had pulled that caused trouble for Edgar and Lydia. "Lucinda's mother comes from the upper middle class. She worked as a governess. My dear brother married her, but when our elder brother, heir to the county, suddenly died and the title fell to him, he drove her out. I ought to have spared a thought for Lucinda before estranging myself from him. She was only 2 years old at the time." It seemed the Countess felt greatly responsible for her niece's poor attitude. "Although it took me far too long, I have decided to re-educate Lucinda in the matter of decorum. She will be staying here until she has learned how to behave like a perfect lady and is ready for her debut. I vow that I shall have her apologize to you one day, but for the time being, I ask that you overlook her impudence." "Gladly." Lydia nodded. "I was also somewhat belligerent and immature in my interactions with her. Come, you must be strong in spirit. You are going to have to drive away countless women who have eyes for your fiancé." "Please, Lady Ortred. I shan't be putting her through such anguish," Edgar said, sounding very much like he meant it. "Oh, really?" the Countess responded with a giggle. "Just as doubtful," Lydia grimaced. "Forgive me, but is your ladyship still willing to teach me in the ways of etiquette?" It was why she had come here in the first place. Now that Lady Ortred had returned safe and sound, she was preparing herself to begin her education in earnest. "I would like for Lydia to return with me to London," Edgar interjected. "I beg your pardon," she asked. He was looking at her anxiously. "There is no need for that. I shan't be throwing myself into any more danger." "That isn't the reason." Edgar turned his gaze to Lady Ortred. "We are preparing for our wedding, and I realized that it is in Lydia's best interest to spend that time as peacefully as possible. She has greatly pushed herself without relying on me at all, and I fail to see the sense in that. My intention was to quell any anxieties she might have harbored before our wedding, but I would rather she find comfort in my presence, whether we are before other noblemen and women, or Her Majesty herself. I shall endeavor to ensure she can do so." Lydia felt as if he had said just that in her dream. Or perhaps he had spoken those words to her by her bedside while she was only half awake. His sentiment seemed to settle deep within her chest. The situation hadn't been entirely his fault. It was also because she had struggled to accept his help. "I understand," Lady Ortred replied. "Besides, Lydia, I do not have anything to teach you. You display a great degree of compassion for others. That is the very lesson I teach the young ladies who come to see me, that compassion is far more important than proper etiquette or indeed anything else." She picked up a card from the table beside her chair. "This is from Alexandrina. She had to leave early this morning, so she asked me to pass it on to you. Her Grace has gone already, but I wasn't able to see her off. She didn't wish to wake you. You were unwell to start with, yet you persisted in your duties. A good period of rest was long overdue." Edgar, who was flawless when it came to his social dealings, had naturally been there to give the Duchess a proper goodbye. "You will be able to see her again in London. She has invited you to a ball as a show of gratitude." The card was the invitation in question. It was signed Victoria R. "Isn't it wonderful, Lydia?" he went on. "Not only will you have an audience with Her Majesty, but she has personally approved of your debut." Her Majesty? She was visiting Lady Ortred incognito. Incognito. Lydia tried to make sense of the word. "Your ladyship referred to Her Grace as Alexandrina." "Yes," Lady Ortred replied. "She is Alexandrina Victoria." But, Lydia stammered, pressing her hands to her cheeks and freezing. You mean to say that Her Grace is? She was horrified by all the things she had said to the Queen so thoughtlessly, including grumblings and complaints. She hadn't even seen Her Majesty off. I was able to introduce you to Her Majesty, and you were able to speak with her, Edgar said. All you need do now is to present yourself proudly to the court with that very special invitation in hand. But I haven't the first idea about etiquette. You ought to be fine knowing only the fundamentals. Duchess Masefield will be able to teach you in plenty of time once she returns to London. Besides, Lydia, the other guests will be more concerned with my behavior than yours, for I shall be the one asking for a dance from the young lady favored by Her Majesty the Queen. It all sounded very familiar to Lydia. Could her dream have been prophetic? She was beginning to feel dizzy. Then you must rely on him to do what is beyond you. You are to be married to him, are you not? As she recalled Brightberry's words, she found she was most grateful for the sympathy behind them. It would appear that everything is in place for the two of you to announce your engagement. I dare say Lucinda will not be best pleased, said Lady Ortred. I would not be concerned for Lady Lucinda, Edgar replied. She was taken with my appearance but little else. Lydia wasn't sure she approved. It sounded as if he were admitting to allowing Lucinda to be taken in by his features before deliberately crushing the fantasies he had encouraged. Edgar. What is it? She hesitated. We shall discuss it later. It wasn't as if she could ask him what he had done to Lucinda and Annie in Lady Ortred's presence. The Countess seemed to misunderstand, however, and offered a smile as she left the room to give them some privacy. Were you eager for us to be alone? Edgar asked. No. Lydia stammered. I was. He leaned toward her and scooped up a lock of her hair, as he seemed to enjoy doing. Though she called it russet, he alone described it as caramel-colored. Say, Edgar, why would Annie take Lady Lucinda as her hostage? For whatever reason, she seemed frightened that you would kill them both. The Earl began to play with her hair between his fingertips, as though he had no knowledge of what she was asking him. There was a minor incident. She couldn't be confident that there was nothing more to it. Edgar was very good at planning incidents, after all. He was ruthless when it came to his enemies, hence why he hadn't hesitated to put Annie in danger by encouraging her to give voice to her wish. Unable to rid himself of that cruelty, he remained on guard and ready to fight should the need come. As such, he had yet to commit himself to a tranquil lifestyle. Lydia was certain that he had more than just their upcoming wedding on his mind, even now. Which begged the question. Edgar, she began, did you perhaps know that Her Majesty would be visiting the estate? How could I have known? He responded with a smile. She knew he was being dishonest, and she had to wonder how he had come into possession of what would have been a state secret. The dizziness that overcame her had all sorts of causes. It would seem that Lady Luck herself looks favorably on us, he stated. Wouldn't that be something? Lydia raised her head, only to see that familiar smile immediately before her. It was perhaps the expression most characteristic of him, cheerful, yet utterly shameless. Edgar's arch-nemesis was dead, and yet he continued to fight. She didn't know why that should be the case, and she only prayed that she would be able to support him fully when the truth came to light, that the day would come when he didn't feel the need to conceal his scheming and suffering behind that smile. It was for these reasons that she struggled once again to convey how happy and grateful she was for her regard necklace. That said, she still wanted Edgar's desire for her own, and so she dared to squeeze the hand that held hers.